The UK government's response to the Women and Equalities Committee report, Menopause and the Workplace, is described as a missed opportunity as they rejected most recommendations that seek to improve the detrimental and discriminatory treatment faced by menopausal women at work.
My name is Gemma Bailey and I am a Senior Associate in the Employment and Immigration team at Capital Law. I've been practicing now for roughly 14 years and always specialised in employment for that time, with a significant amount of work being in the area of the Equality Act. And I'm joined by David Sheppard.
Hello, my name is David Sheppard. I'm also a Senior Associate at Capital Law. Also have a similar period of experience as a qualified solicitor, also working in employment law, and obviously have knowledge of the Equality Act.
What are the symptoms? The severity of menopausal symptoms can vary in duration, severity, and for some, they can have significant impact on everyday activities. Most women will experience menopausal symptoms, and these can begin months or even years before a woman's period stops and can last for around 4 years after her last period, although some women experience this for a lot longer. Some common symptoms consist of hot flushes, night sweats, mood changes such as low mood or anxiety, difficulty sleeping, problems with memory and concentration, and much more. The decrease in the body's production of estrogen can affect many parts of the body: the brain, the skin, and the strength and the density of the bones. Also, menopausal women face an increased risk of osteoporosis, and there is evidence to suggest that the fall in hormone levels can increase vulnerability to heart disease and strokes.
So that's taken from an article which Capital have prepared, one of many articles that Capital have prepared on the menopause. This one shortly following the government's response to the Women and Equalities Committee's recommendations. And I think it's quite an interesting thing just to plot back to November 2021, where we've got a Minister for Employment calling for employers to strengthen their support for menopause in the workplace. At that point, it was identified that 1 in 4 women were leaving work because of menopause. Serious symptoms were leading to about 32 weeks of leave on average. And they were urging at that stage for 50 plus champions. Fast forward to May 2022, and the Fawcett Society conducted a survey of 4,000 women between 45 and 55 and identified that 1 in 10 had left their jobs due to menopause. 44% of those women surveyed said that their abilities were adversely affected, and 52% reported a loss in confidence. If we're losing 900,000 women partway through that career curve, that is probably at something approaching the peak of their earning capacity or nearly there, and they're dropping out of the system, which I thought was a really interesting interplay between the gender pay gap and the issue of menopause in the workplace.
Absolutely. I think, no, my take, it's that disparity that as males hit 50 plus, they've done their childcare and family duties, and they have that freedom to promote and increase their earning capacity and reach the, if you like, the pinnacle of their careers. Whereas as women enter this age group, it becomes more difficult. They face a new challenge in terms of the menopause. And I think the main take home for me is the significant dropout in the labour market during this demographic, and particularly following acute labour shortages within this country, potentially due to the pandemic and people reappraising their priorities, but also as a result of Brexit and difficulties in acquiring overseas labour, that this huge cohort within the labour market is falling out due to health issues, and it's very much something that we feel needs to be addressed going forward.
And is preventable. The loss of all that knowledge and all that talent and that honed skill is a preventable loss.
Absolutely.
Menopause as a protected characteristic. The decision to reject the recommendation to launch a consultation on how to amend the law to make menopause a separate protected characteristic was justified by the government in their response as follows: to avoid unintended consequences which may inadvertently create new forms of discrimination. For example, discrimination risks towards men suffering from long-term medical conditions or eroding existing protections. The more substantial the necessary changes to the 2010 Act are, the more likely it is that they would require a full-scale review of the Act. The government's response to rejecting the recommendation rests on the basis that creating a protection only afforded to women may inadvertently discriminate against men. But with the UK economy in such desperate need to retain talent and ensure more women are economically active in later years, and to repair the damage caused by the pandemic, a consultation at the least to investigate this further would have been sensible and pragmatic.
So that really follows nicely from what we were just talking about. There was some analytics of court records back in June 2022, which started to track quite a significant increase in employment tribunal claims mentioning menopause or citing menopause. So there's a 44% increase, although the numbers themselves are still relatively low. These were going into disability claims, unfair dismissal claims, and sex discrimination claims. A lot of emphasis from the experts at the time was on the requirements for employers to think about training, to think about implementing policies, to think about a code of conduct more generally around handling issues arising from menopause in the workplace. Interestingly as well, we did an article back in December 22, on the ET case for Mrs. McCabe, who brought a claim against Salazar, and she actually brought a claim for age discrimination. It was harassment on grounds of age, because she had been, and I'm paraphrasing, she'd been called a hormonal woman and they needed to replace her with somebody younger and more on board. What I think is quite interesting about what we're seeing in the trends and where those claims are currently falling is two things. There isn't something which really nicely fits menopause in terms of a protection. It's either got to be something which the symptoms are so serious that it's falling in disability, or it's something that only a woman would experience, or in the case of McCabe, only an older person would experience. But of course we have no dual characteristic function, so there's a risk of falling between two stools. And a lot of commentary that I'm reading is that because there's this failure in the Equality Act, most women just won't take on the fight.
Yep.
And I think that is probably part of the reason that we're not seeing menopause cited in a vast number of cases, because 23 cases in 2022 in the Employment Tribunal just doesn't match 900,000 people leaving employment.
No, I think that's the significant gap in protection to women with menopausal symptoms, because as you said, you need to shoehorn a claim or a legal protection into a other protected characteristic which doesn't necessarily follow your condition. So, for example, for age, to have an age discrimination claim, you'd have to show you were treated less favorably because you were older. That would be usually very difficult to prove. For gender or sex, again, you'd have to show you've been treated less favorably because you were a woman. Again, that would be difficult to prove that there was less favorable treatment because of your sex per se. And then for disability, you have to go through the necessary evidential burden of establishing that the menopausal symptoms were of such an extreme impact on your day-to-day activities that it meets the legal definition of disability. And many menopausal employees will not want to have that label of disability in order to, have some form of recognition of their condition at work. So I think that absence of the menopause in itself being a protected characteristic must have an impact on individuals' willingness to assert any legal protection in the workplace. And I think the other issue to mention as well is that obviously the government's rationale for not making menopause a protected characteristic is because it's a female-only issue generally, but that doesn't necessarily recognise that pregnancy, maternity, those are specific protected characteristics which are afforded only to females generally. So that doesn't seem to explain why the government is resistant to introducing new protected characteristics. And the bottom line is, in absence of pregnancy being a protected characteristic, a female who is pregnant would have to compare their treatment to a male who is not pregnant but has symptoms similar to pregnancy. And that just does a disservice to the reality of the situation, and that pregnancy, like menopause, is a condition linked to reproductive health, which is unique to females and therefore should have that special recognition in the legislation.
Absolutely. And I think that there is a practical difficulty or challenge for women seeking to launch claims citing menopause as the cause of the acts that they've been subjected to. And if we think just about the disability scenario, the likelihood of them having medical records which accurately track the symptoms that they've been experiencing, I think, is actually much lower, because you wouldn't necessarily perhaps go to your doctor for night sweats or for brain fog. It may well take quite a long time before you actually seek medical assistance, if you even do. The claims that we've seen come through, Mrs. McCabe was quite an extreme example. That's just pure harassment, being called a hormonal woman. It doesn't seem quite right that it has to be either extreme, whether that's in severity of symptoms or on the seriousness of the treatment that you've been experiencing, for it to really get across a threshold which is worth pursuing.
Yeah, I think it's important to identify what would be a common example is a woman of menopausal age who has mild menopausal symptoms, which are common to thousands of others, but is generally struggling to meet her previous levels of performance, and that she falls out of the workplace either because the employer initiates performance management processes, or she feels demotivated or disillusioned with work. There would be no legal protection in that scenario because she would not meet the legal definition of disability. She hasn't been treated less favorably because of her age per se, nor has she been treated less favorably because of her sex per se. So there's certainly a lacuna, if you like to call it that, in terms of legal protection in that very common scenario.
And to play devil's advocate, there may well be an argument of, well, doesn't that happen in everything? Isn't there's sort of strength and degree in most things that affect performance and attendance, which I absolutely accept is true. But I come back to, we've got 900,000 women potentially leaving the workplace earlier than they need to, perhaps because there's still some weakness in the protections available to them should the workplace situation create additional strain on their health due to symptoms arising from the menopause.
The government claims that the protection sought by the committee in their report is adequately provided for under the current provisions of the Equality Act. However, the existing protections of age, disability and sex do not fit neatly with the unique combination factors concerning menopause, and therefore, women who are discriminated against because of their menopausal symptoms are put off bringing claims because of the uncertainty of the outcome, and ultimately would have to establish the menopausal symptoms are severe enough to amount to a disability and trigger a duty to make reasonable adjustments, or alternatively, they are being treated less favourably than a hypothetical younger employee or male employee suffering similar health conditions. We have no doubt that worker rights will be a central area of debate in next year's general election, and a major part of this will be the implementation of specific protections for employees with menopausal symptoms.
In light of that, as we understand it, in response to the committee report, the government is proposing to appoint a menopause ambassador that would launch a menopause public health campaign, and then there'd be other peripheral changes such as reducing the cost of HRT prescriptions, removing dual prescription charges for estrogen and progesterone, and introducing a right to request flexible working as a day one right, although it should be said that that's already a legislative proposal which would apply across for all workers, not just workers with menopausal symptoms. So I think it's fair to say that the government is taking a very much a hands-off approach in terms of intervening regarding menopause in the workplace. It's strongly resisted introducing menopause as a protected characteristic, and it's also resisted any proposals to have pilot schemes within the public sector allowing a menopausal leave policy. But I think, Gemma, that this will very much be a huge political issue, particularly as we're going to enter a general election year next year.
I agree. Interestingly, in December there was a press release from the government that they were making 1.97 million available to 16 charities who would support women experiencing reproductive health issues in the workplace. So this isn't only menopausal, but clearly this is something that they're happy to release money for charities to support employers on their own path. But I totally agree with you. There's no sign that there's anything more to come from the legislation.
I think it's quite interesting also to mention that this will be a political fault line coming in the next general election, because coincidentally the Labour Party have released plans to have a menopause action plan which would apply to large employers of 250 or more employees. So these employers already have obligations in terms of gender pay gap reporting, but there'll also be obligations in terms of adjustments for menopause, adjusting work conditions, allowing leave, and also training. So again, that seems to be something that Labour are positioning themselves against the Conservatives when it comes to the next general election, and I'm sure the menopause and other employment law rights will be a core issue of the general election debate we can look forward to in the next couple of months.
I think that's right. And I think if there's anything positive to pull out of this, it really goes back to what you said at the beginning, Di, that the issue of menopause is much more a talking point now. And that of itself will bring it onto the agenda for many responsible employers who are genuinely wanting to retain very good talent of highly skilled people who might otherwise be inclined to leave quietly. We're not only talking about the harassing and discriminating employers, we at least, with it on the agenda for the political argument, I think that will of itself have had some positive effect on employers generally who are trying to do right by their staff. Thank you for listening to this discussion from the Capital Law Employment team on menopause and the workplace. If you're interested in similar updates from Capital, you can find more employment articles at capitallaw.co.uk, and you'll be able to sign up for our employment newsletter.